Okay, so for the last part of our class, we're going to talk about some other statutes related to water and its preservation and its environmental value. Okay, so a big one is the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. So many of you might be too young to remember the Exxon Valdez spill, but it was up in Alaska, and there was kind of a drunk driver of this big oil tanker boat, and that crashed, and it spilled like I don't know, gazillion gallons of oil into the ocean. So that spurred on the EPA to, regulate this stuff. So the Oil Pollution Act strengthened the EPA, their ability to either prevent or to respond to these catastrophic oil spills. Um, rather than there being jurisdictional fights over who's in charge in the event of such an oil spill, and it makes it clear that the federal government is the boss. Um, a trust fund was set up. There's a tax on oil, and that a certain percentage of that tax goes into a trust fund to clean up these oil spills in the event that the wrongdoer doesn't have enough money or is unwilling to do so. Um, there are the oil storage facilities and vessels, right? These tanker boats have to submit to the federal government their plans on what they're going to do if there is a large discharge. There are certain oil vessel requirements, quality of these oil vessels, inspections, piloting standards, right? So you don't have your drunk captain. So backup people or, tests that they have to take. Um, really a big spelling out of the scope of liability for oil spills. And then for areas, ocean areas where these oil tankers go through, they have to develop contingency plans to prepare for oil spill, in these regions. It is a strict liability statute. So, no matter whether it was your fault or not, if your vessel or your tank spills the oil, you are liable. Okay. And they gives the EPA authority to regulate not just oil tankers, but above ground storage facilities, and then the Coast Guard can regulate oil tankers. Another thing that happened after, the Oil Pollution Act was that Deepwater Horizon settlement. That was not that big oil drilling rig. I think it was in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the movie with Mark Wahlberg. So yeah, there was a with BP Amoco, and there was BP had to pay a lot of money. So rather than people paying money, then the spillers actually have to pay the money. So that is the Oil Pollution Act. I think this is on the quiz, prompted by the Exxon Valdez spill. The Exxon Valdez was the name of the vessel. Um, Another big, super, super, super important to us, to everyone, is the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974. Okay, so the Safe Drinking Water Act applies to public water systems. Okay, so if I have like a well that like is for me and my family, that is not subject to the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. Okay, so kind of says that public water systems have to provide safe drinking water, and that responsibility is divided among the EPA, states, if it's tribal lands, and the public. Okay, the EPA sets out these standards, drinking water standards, um, and the national primary drinking water regulations have these maximum contaminant levels, like that TMDL, and it gives us ways to treat water to remove these contaminants. And the water systems are required to test for these contaminants on a regular basis to make sure that they're giving you clean water. And if they, in the event that they aren't, you have to be notified, and maybe there's a boil order, or maybe you're getting new water. Okay. Okay. They set these national standards for tap water. It's a health goal. Okay. Right. We want it to be safe to drink. Okay. And then based on what is healthy and safe to drink, they set a legal limit for any contaminants in the drinking water. So there might be mercury or lead in the water that we drink, but as long as it's at an acceptable level that would not risk your health, um, that you are then you're okay. Okay. And then they might have a required treatment technique, right? To get your water as close to the health goal as feasible. Okay, so there's two kinds of standards. Your primary standards, that's the ones that's the health standards, right? And the secondary standards are, I wouldn't say optional, but they are recommended. Okay, so those are contaminants that affect the appearance or odor of water. Okay, so that would be like, does it smell like sulfur? Is it cloudy? Um, does it taste weird? Right? So those are not federally enforceable, but they are recommended. Okay. Contaminants are defined as a physical, chemical, biological, or radiological substance in the matter in the water, right? So it's not just like sediment or whatever. It can be chemical or biological, and the EPA establishes this recommended. Remember, we talked about TMDLs for the effluent. So this is the recommended maximum contaminant level. So we could have whatever percentage, tiny bit of one of these contaminants, as long as that is going to keep us safe and healthy. You can that can be in the tap water. So the final EPA standard is either this MCL or this required water technique, right? So that would be a technology based standard. Okay. And so that was 1974. So in 1986, what is that? 12 years later, amendments were added to the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay. Because the EPA was taking too long to figure out these final standards. And they felt that the act, some areas didn't have the resources to comply with the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Okay, so the Safe Drinking Water Act, like I said, applies to public drinking water systems. Okay, with at least 15 connections, and that services at least 25 people. Okay, so piped water for human consumption. So not like what we're given to the farm animals or whatever. So anything in a piped water, this is a public drinking water system. It doesn't apply to a private well. Um, so this recommended maximum contaminant level in 1986 was changed to a goal, maximum contaminant level goal. And that is set at the level that there's no known effects on people, and EPA sets the level for each known contaminant, and no carcinogens are allowed in the water for it to be acceptable. Okay, so there's monitoring added, new standards. There's a cost benefit analysis. Can the municipality afford this new technology standard? Water systems have to report to the EPA, working on preventing contamination, working on expanding the capacity. So, funding and loans to local public water systems, um, testing, right? These are things that EPA has to work on, chemical additives and testing. There's a fund, so to help protect these drinking water sources and improve infrastructure. If you are a water system operator, you have to have certain training and have to be certified. There's a safe drinking water hotline. if you're concerned about your water, an EPA website, even small water systems, smaller towns might be given federal assistance to reach their standards, and states have an obligation to assess these drinking water sources. So that's a lot that these amendments added. Um, 2002, not a coincidence that this was enacted in 2002, because 2001 was the 9/11, but the Bioterrorism Act of 1902 requires community drinking water systems and the EPA to work on their vulnerabilities. Okay. What is the vulnerability of this water source, this water system, right? They don't want terrorists to go in and poison a water system and, kill hundreds of thousands of people. Okay. So they're working to assess what is a vulnerability, what happens uh, in case of an emergency, and to work on security and technology to preserve safe drinking water. I mean, that's like terrifying to think about that. um, so this, you think about the Safe Drinking Water Act, and I think most of you guys will remember, the water issues in Flint, Michigan in the mid 2010s. um, and this is just a kind of like a almost like a timeline of what happened. So what happened in Flint? So Flint was getting it was not Lake Huron water, right? So their Great Lake, they were getting Lake Huron water, right? So then the governor's like, you know what, we're going to improve our pipeline to Flint for Lake Huron water, but in the meantime, we have to like shut it off to make a better pipeline, and then we're in the meantime they're going to use the Flint River as the water source. Okay, so then what happened? Remember, we talked about, and this is kind of part of your, this is about your discussion board, but these secondary standards, where is that? Secondary standards, um, contaminants that affect the appearance of odor or water, right? Which aren't mandatory, right? Um, so people in Flint started noticing that their water started to smell funny and maybe looked like brown, like iron-ish, right? So they didn't like it and it tasted bad. So then um, the local water system, here's my timeline here. Um, realizes that there is, fecal bacterium, and that's kind of what's like not cool. And they put a boil water advisory on, for people using this water. Okay, so that one of the additives, to purify the water or to kill, the bacteria is chlorine. So they added a bunch of chlorine into the water, which we know that there's chlorine or chlorine and fluoride, this stuff in the water. And then what happened was the pipes that were going to these from the Flint River to the homes were old, and the chlorine started to oxidize these pipes, these lead pipes, and basically eroded the lead in there, and then the lead was going to into the water. So they were actually better with the E. coli in a boil order than when we were doing the lead. So, all right, here's what happened. So that's they added, um, they figured out that, oh yeah, so even like GM stopped using the city water because the chlorine level was so high, it was corroding engine parts. Um, so they offered the Detroit water system offered to reconnect them with Lake Huron water, but city officials said, no, our water rates will go up too high, so we're not going to do that. And then like the citizens like they're like, this water is freaking terrible. Okay. And here is what happens. And like just like somebody sends this woman, Leanne Walters, sends a sample of her water to this guy in the EPA to test. And the testing revealed that her water had, look at this, 104 parts per billion of lead, where that maximum level is 15 parts per billion. Okay, so what is that? Like 10 times more. And she follows. Oh, and then it's 397. So Flint city members stop recommend that it happens, but emergency manager, this guy Jerry Ambrose, says, nah, the Detroit water's just as bad. Um, okay, so this is your smoking gun memo. Later in 2015, this EPA manager says this water in Flint is terrible. Um, and the thing is, because this is state run, the EPA really doesn't have anything to do with it, right? It's and the EPA never, they could have stepped in, but they never stepped in because this is like a state issue, right? The your water and the whole clean water, it's all enforced by the state. Um, this was leaked and whatever. So it got to be terrible and a big mess. So that's kind of what happened in Flint. So your discussion board, which I'll get, you're not done yet, but your discussion board is about what happened in Flint. So you can read in detail that article and answer the questions in the discussion board. But that's under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it was just like terrible, terrible what happened in Flint. And it's also kind of a case of environmental racism, right? Flint, but not racism or lack of environmental justice for poorer people who live in Flint, not getting represented and getting bad water. Um, oh, another. This is about the what I was talking about, wetlands. So what's happened in Florida is in like the Everglades area, these farmers, sugar farmers, have like filled in a lot of these wetlands and created these sugar farms, right? These sugarcane farms. And then the Everglades, which acts as a natural aquifer, a natural filtering of water through Florida and down to the ocean, are failing. And I don't know if you have heard of the red tide, but down in the Gulf Coast, periodically they have something called the red tide. And sometimes the water actually looks red and sometimes it doesn't. But like these chemicals from up north in Florida go into the ocean, and there's like major fish kills, like dead fish showing up, and it's just like the water is toxic certain parts of the year. So that's also has to other environmental crises about water, um, from industrialization. So you might want to read that for fun. Another statute that deals with water is this Coastal Zone Management Act, which is voluntary. Okay, so it's not mandatory at this point. So it encourages states that are on a coast to come up with their own management plans to protect their resources like wetlands, estuaries, beaches, dunes, barrier islands, as well as the wildlife in those areas. So, I mean, it's an act that like tells you what you should come up with, but doesn't mandate it. So, not a lot of teeth. Um, the chapter also has a little discussion on ethical duties. If your client is somehow not appropriately complying with their permits, or they're dumping or something illegally, and so we know about attorney-client privilege. so that things discussed are confidential, or if they're discussing something that they have done in the past, that is confidential and may not be revealed. But if you look on page 235 under what Rule 1.6b, if they have to, if you can prevent future harm or potential death, um, so if they're planning on, if they're, it's continuing and it's causing, great harm, you might have an obligation, an ethical obligation to report that behavior. But again, as a paralegal, I wouldn't do it. You can, if you know something, you can tell the attorney in your office, and they can make that judgment call. You don't want to be, you're not practicing law. You're obligated under that umbrella of privilege, and that should be the attorney's call and not yours. Okay, so let's go back to the module and go to the end. So this week for your assignments, we have reading. Well, I guess the reading for next week, but you have your quiz. You have the written assignment are those review questions, and then the discussion board on the Safe Drinking Water Act and Flint. And then, so that's due at the end of this week. And then next week is your next test. So that will be for what chapters? 5, 7, 8, 9, and climate change, which really wasn't a chapter. So that will be open from Monday through Friday, but you have to take it in one sitting. So that is your assignment for next week. So I won't be chatting with you next week, but of course, reach out. And if you have questions, to chat with me. All right. Have a great week.